Go ahead. Where you were.
Just right into it. Yeah. So as I'm walking off the platform or limping off the platform, we had talked a few times. And I mentioned, maybe I found how strong I can get, because this is the third time where I felt like I was at my all-time strongest. And when I went to showcase it, I got hurt. Then it was also like, well, I can't quote unquote retire from powerlifting on an injury. So I gotta get back on the horse and do it again. And then I was like, I don't really want to. And I didn't have fun training for this meet training the way I had to stay injury free. But then I can also use my creative brain and find a more fun way that I could prep for the meet and still be able to stay injury free and healthy. So it's just a lot going through my mind. Regardless, I know that I don't think it's smart to prep for the meet that I was planning on doing in 10 weeks, given that I probably won't be able to squat for a few weeks, or deadlift. And I wanted to, compete in bodybuilding. And that's a perfect way to add some tissue and change up the stimulus and have some fun in a different way. So regardless if this is my last meet or not, it's not a decision that I have to make anytime soon.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, perfect time to pivot for you.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Sweet.
Yeah, I mean, it was your healthiest prep that you ever had.
Yeah, for sure, without question.
So that's something to think about. And the idea of like stepping away with perfection in mind is going to be something that very few people ever really do. So you may be chasing something that's not necessarily healthy to chase, that may not ever come to fruition too, right? Like sometimes you don't get to decide what's the ideal scenario for you to leave the sport. Sometimes the sport decides for you. Most of the time the sport decides for you. Right. Yeah. So, the idea of continuing to push things is something that, I don't know, eventually, if you're not having fun anymore and your body's deteriorating on you and it's telling you, enough's enough, you got to put the ego aside sometimes and listen to it. Right.
Oh, totally. And all of those thoughts have gone through my mind of like, I've always loved the training more than I love the competing. It's always been the case for me. So I got to find that love of training again. I got to have some fun in the gym. And if I feel personally that I need a little bit more tissue on my frame to be a bit more resilient, then that'll be the short-term, medium-term goal. And then if I start to have fun again, maybe I tried another creative way to stay healthy during prep and prep for a meet. I think the one thing I can definitely point to is I think I trained way too heavy for way too long.
Why is that?
So I pulled over 16 times out of 18 weeks. I squatted over 7.
Yeah, but why is that? Why is that a bad thing? That's what your sport is. Why would that be a bad thing?
I've never done that before.
Yeah, but why would you think that that's a bad thing?
I don't necessarily think it's inherently bad. I don't think it's necessary. I think I can get,
It might just be that it was above the threshold that your volume tolerance was going to be for the specific station that had to do it. Right.
My volume was one. I only did 1 rep.
There you go. So maybe it was just the overall chronic loading that was just too far above in the percentages that your body was going to tolerate for that time. So maybe having it sit back just a couple 10% less and hitting the same singles, doubles, or triples may have done better for you, and you would have landed it.
Totally.
That would be my thought. But
that's kind of where I'm thinking is I trained too heavy for too long, especially given the chronic hip shift that I have on that squat. So if I could get away with less, I think that'd be a good way to start looking at troubleshooting it. And it doesn't hurt to be bigger.
Yeah.
Never.
I mean, I don't know.
Never.
In my theory, it's, you said this was the healthiest meet prep you've ever done, and this was the least amount of volume you've ever done and the heaviest you've lifted. So I don't understand why you're going to let something that didn't come to fruition on meet day deter you from what was the best prep of your career so far. Just doesn't make any sense. It wasn't the prep that injured you.
You're
It's the
speaking out of both
process
sides
versus
here.
the outcome, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's process versus outcome. Like the outcome is what matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're blaming the outcome on your training.
So did you.
I blamed the outcome on your refeed.
Yeah, I don't think I can get on board with that one.
So why didn't you get injured the rest of training?
Maybe it just wasn't enough. Wasn't the
It was
right.
what you were doing the entire time. You were doing singles. You did more volume in your training than you did on the meet.
Only because I didn't finish the meet.
I don't buy that. But if you wanna dissect your training, then that's fine. I wouldn't think about that. I would think that you trained at 232 and you were very successful, and you made 220, and then you got up to 244, and you dropped 7 pounds the night before, and you overate and overhydrated and dehydrated at night, and came in and you were dry and you pulled a muscle.
One way of looking at it.
All right. Well, we won't go any further down this road.
No.
Well, maybe a little bit, right? Like Nick, you were getting ready for competition as well, right? You were doing bodybuilding and you were prepping, and you, I believe, pulled the plug on it. You don't really talk about competition too much on your page, because that's not really what you do on your page. You're an educator more than a competitor. But what were some of the things, if you don't mind talking about it, that made you decide like prep and compete, and maybe wasn't the best call for you at that time? I know you got injured with your finger. You almost lost like an entire digit. So
Yeah. So it kind of started with that, but I can even bring it back to the year before. So I had 2 preps that I had to pull the plug for the exact same reason on in the last 2 years, where the first one, it was last summer. And just the way that, I mean, you guys have me on here to talk, presumably because I'm a bodybuilder that actually trains with heavy weights. So
an intelligent bodybuilder. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But I can at least cross paths with you guys and be able to say that I'm not just lifting 315 for sets of 15, doing
Yes,
some
sir.
volume training behind. Yeah. So, but with that capacity for output that I have on a chronic basis and that I built up over time, walking into the competitive arena of bodybuilding for the first time, I never experienced getting all the way down in body fat levels and being in that state of like just physiological fatigue in itself from the dieting and the consistent training to stay on track with everything, and the cardio included, and obviously the drug element. Had never been like that before. And so I was able, all the way up to, in all the years that I've been training up to that first prep, being able to just have consistent high outputs session after session after session after session. And then I continued with that same type of training model into that prep. And then as things go with, the whole ethos of the bodybuilding prep and training is what brought you there and got you the tissue is what you stick with. And so I was like, all right, I have my baseline set with the things that I've done for this long. I'm just going to try and hold on to as much as I can with the base patterns that I have in place, because I know that they're consistent, and then bring them through. But with everything that was involved, plus I actually moved at that time. COVID had started at that time. I had a almost 3 year long relationship that just ended. And
a lot of variables.
So like I had a ton of stuff going on. And so just the overall stress like cracked me completely.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have the ability to balance it all very well. And so after that point, I was at like 6-ish weeks out from the show, and I put on an insane amount of water. Like not just enough to blur the lines and you're like, I don't really know where we're at because I'm like 5, 6, 7 pounds up. I'm just like, I don't know, we'll figure it out and we'll keep going. Like started with 15 pounds in a couple of days, then got to 20 by the end of the week, and got to 30 by the end of the next week. And then it didn't go away. We rotated drugs out. We pulled them all completely. We dropped the training out to nothing. We played with the cardio, played with like everything that you can think of.
Holy
Nothing
shit.
got rid of it. Yeah. And so the edema was so bad that like my legs were consistently purple.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Well, beyond that, you're starting to get into like the danger zone of your heart and having severe health consequences. So
exactly. And so like that happened with the first one. and then obviously had to pull the plug on that and just let it go.
Yeah.
And so the only thing that got me out of that was multiple months of me just handling everything and taking a step back and just doing only what I could to get myself to recover. And honestly, if I'm honest with myself now, looking back at where I am at this point, I didn't do a good enough job in that interim period between that first prep and the second one for me to actually handle all of the contributing factors that brought me to that place the first time. I had done it enough that I could recover my state to having like edema was gone and my general feel of how I was okay. I was functioning at least, and I could do most of what I should be able to do, but I still wasn't perfect. And with that, I still wanted to get a show under my belt because the biggest knock on me professionally is, well, you're a bodybuilding coach and you're an educator, but you haven't competed. It's like, well, fair enough. Yeah. So go out and try and do it. And I wanted to get that one in. And the same thing pretty much happened the second time. It started off with all the same contributors, ramping up little by little, changed the training a little bit, but not quite as much as it should have been. And then 5-6 weeks in, I, like you said, blew off my thumb in a reverse pec deck, which is the most ludicrous way that anybody has ever done that.
Yeah.
But, and I didn't drop it in the stack for anybody that's listening that's not familiar. Like, it's not just like I dropped it in the pin and, you know, I actually had the handles, my thumb over one of them. My right thumb was the one that I crushed. It's on the inside of the handle. And then I dropped the full stack and smashed both of them together. And it was like two hammers coming together at the full speed of free fall in the full weight of the whole stack, and blew off the end of my thumb. And so, yeah. And so I'm actually pretty lucky that I even have something that resembles a finger.
Yeah, definitely.
At least you don't pull hook grip.
That's true. And actually, I used to love pulling hook grip as like my warm-ups into my deadlifts, but I can no longer do that, unfortunately.
That's why we know you hate yourself.
Yep. Yep. So that's out of the picture for at least now. That happened in April. And then I had to deal with that. That was 8 weeks of me continuing to diet. I continued to prep in the best way that I could.
Yeah.
It being like a completely open fracture, like it literally exploded. And so like everything was open, torn apart. They reconstructed it. And then I had like 6 weeks-ish that I couldn't really even do like cardio or have my arm down at my side for very long because the blood pressure to it was just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it could have like reopened all of the sutures that were just from the blood pressure alone, because there was really nothing holding it together but the sutures themselves. And so I just kept dieting, kept doing what I had to do, pulled all the PEDs and everything, and actually got better, which was amazing. Yeah. So I got better throughout that whole period of time. And then after that, I could start training again, and everything started to go back downhill. It started rolling itself over, and I started getting inflamed, and I just dealt with it for the next 4 or 6 weeks. And then that again, about 6 weeks out, when the hammer hits and the pedal hits the floor, happened the same thing again. 10 pounds in a couple of days, 15 pounds in a week, 30 pounds at the end of the second week, and would not go away. And so I had to pull the plug again for the second time.
Did you get blood work while that was happening?
Yeah, I did. And actually, to my surprise, even my surprise, because I was expecting it to be pretty messed up, especially like kidney values.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
It was completely clean, and not even like bodybuilder clean. Like I expect half of these things to be double the reference range. And no, it's okay. I'm a bodybuilder.
Right.
No, like normal range clean.
What?
Yeah. And so the only thing that was really out of whack was blood pressure, which would be
Makes sense.
Yeah, 30 pounds. Yeah.
Yeah. But with that, I mean, I pulled the plug again and just sat it out for a little while and did what I could. And now it's been, 3 months? And about now, everything is normalizing. I'm getting a much better grasp, and I have everything on record. I knew everything that I was doing. Have all the pieces put together at this point, and all the things that I was reluctant for me to reflect on at the time that were contributing factors to why I landed there are now getting fixed. Like things specifically, sleep. It's awful, horrible for like the last 5 years consistently.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it was an ingrained habit from college, that I had that like my family didn't have any money. So I was paying my way through college and I had a double major and I worked in the biomechanics lab and I had a night job and I had a relationship and 2 dogs and I was training. So
sounds about right.
Yeah, I was like, wake up in the morning at like 7 and then don't go to sleep until 4. And that was
Jesus.
the daily occurrence. Yeah. And so even after school was over with for me and I got everything done, it was like, it was ended by COVID.
Yeah.
And so it was so abrupt that there was no like transition of responsibility type deal. So I didn't have anything that forced me to change. And so the habit stuck.
Yeah.
And so that being in place, that pretty much took away the number one biggest thing that I had to hedge against stress getting overwhelming and then dropping me into a bad physiological state like I did.
Yeah.
That's the number one biggest thing that has been the contributor that has kind of ruined the last 2 preps.
That's huge.
The last 2 years.
Yeah.
And so now that is actually getting managed a hell of a lot better. And so that's already making a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dang. Yeah. I mean, sleep is a very powerful tool, man, for so many things. But wow, that's crazy. I'm glad things are getting fixed though, right? It takes a lot of self-awareness and introspection and putting your ego aside to say that you're the root of your problems instead of blaming something else, right? Like, oh, it's my genetics, or oh, is this, or it's like, no, I got shitty sleep. I'm making poor adult decisions, and maybe my ability to deal with stress isn't as good as I thought it was. So let me fix those lifestyle factors first before even thinking about pursuing quite possibly one of the hardest things on the planet, which is a 16-week bodybuilding prep that requires such meticulous thought and execution. So yeah, interesting. Thanks for sharing that, man.
Yeah. Of course. Open book.
Yeah, no, it's good. That's great that you are, because a lot of people can learn from that. And I think the vulnerability to be able to talk about those things is something that is much needed in our barbell sports, where it's always taught that you have to have this shield and this body armor, and that you can't just show weakness and you can't make mistakes and all this other stuff, right? It's nice to have open dialogue about the mistakes we make and the ways to fix it, and you know, the mental health side of things as well.
Yeah. And you know, that's something that I kind of want to take a pause to say too. So like almost all of us, especially in the social media world now, we kind of talk about all of these lessons as if we're already beyond them, like all the time, like everybody is, because we're educators on them. It's like, but we're not.
No.
We all still have the same struggles that like we would look at somebody else in front of us, like as coaches coming to us and have the same issue and be like, hey, stupid, these are all your problems. This is why this happened. Like we make the exact same problem for ourselves half the time. And we're just like, we're too stubborn to look at it. And it does give this veneer to all of us. Like we're so above everything. And we've gone through all the mistakes way before now. Like, no, a lot of the time we're going through the mistakes, like literally right now. And that's why they're relevant to us to have spoken on them.
Definitely.
And it's not like this perception, like you're saying, that we're all just like above it. And we do have this impenetrable shield and in the armor, like we've done it all, we've seen it all. And here we are now to give you the truth. But now we're going through it all at the same time that everyone else is.
We're learning. Yeah. We're learning just as much as everyone else is, man.
Keep finding ways to make more mistakes.
I'm pretty good at it. So.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at making mistakes. Like I said, this is the 3rd time I've tried to beat my all-time best, and the 3rd time I've gotten hurt trying to do it. But all 3 times have been completely different occurrences.
And you've learned something each time.
I've learned something each time, and I'm sure over the course of the number of clients that I've coached through, I'm sure I've helped them avoid the same things, and maybe, you know, they'll have different problems that I've never had or whatever, but dealing with that as an athlete absolutely makes you a better coach without question.
It's that old cliche of like, you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes, right? Every time you fail, you learn so much more. It's hard to learn from your successes because you are too busy patting yourself on the back, which you should, right? Like you should give yourself a pat on the back when you do stuff that's good, but you should also think about, how could I have done that better? What are the mistakes I still made with my successes along with the failures and stuff? And always trying to have an analytical, critical like viewpoint of things, so that you're always trying to get better without, I guess, detracting from the successes that you've had too. Because a lot of people fall into that category of, never really saying that you're doing good or that you made good choices and you performed well. We're always our harshest critics, even when people. The thing that drives me crazy in powerlifting is like, oh, I 70-pound PR, but I performed like crap today. It's like, no, you didn't. You hit a 70-pound PR, right? Like, why are we focusing on not the 70-pound PR, but we're focusing on, how crappy you did in your post and stuff. It's just something that never sits well with me, right? You don't see Tom Brady winning the Super Bowl being like, yeah, I made so many mistakes. And no, he's like, I won the Super Bowl, like MVP. Like I'll fix everything in a couple months, but right now, let me just enjoy my win.
Yeah.
So if you guys don't know, we have Nick Gloff on, who is part of the Revive team, Camp Jansen down in Stuart with some of the best bodybuilders in the world right now down there. So you guys are having like a playground of crazy athletes in and out of the gym. And Nick on social media delivers a lot of really great content. And one of the reasons we had you on is because of your kind of methodical approach that when it comes to training, that I think a lot of people can benefit from, both in the bodybuilding space and in the strength athletic space. Is this idea that you've been perpetuating a lot lately is, exercise selection and regression to progression patterns that we don't necessarily see a lot of. Like, you're building each block into progressing to the next one, right? And I know a lot of people, at least in powerlifting, I don't see that a lot. I see, they'll do maybe like deficit stiff leg deadlifts one block, and then the next block, you're like, okay, I see where you went with this. Now, what's going to be the progression to that to build off of those, intricacies, right? And maybe it would be like, now you're getting closer to a meet, so we want to lift a little bit more. So then we're going to drop the deficit and go straight to stiff legs. And then as you get closer to the meet, we don't want as much fatigue. So we'll go from stiff legs to out of the rack RDLs, right? And it's like that thought process of exercise selection block to block is something that you've been preaching a lot lately. So I wanted to kind of get you on and get your thoughts on how you started to develop that, and what are some of the key principles that you think of to conceptualize all that together within a program.
Okay. So to start with the regression and progression patterns, mostly, like, I live within more of the bodybuilding world, but a lot of my programming and the kind of base principles do come from like a crossover between powerlifting and bodybuilding. Because I've always seen, especially like I follow you guys in the powerlifting world very closely. Because even though there may not be a lot of people that are putting out like specific detailed information within the powerlifting world, they just more so do it. If you can look at what's happening over long periods of time, you can kind of notice the little bit of trends that happen and how things do undulate and change with the programming style to make like specific changes meet to meet, or from year to year, month to month, that give you the actionable difference between where you started and where you ended and where you're going to go on the next block. And so taking that same approach, knowing that the biggest thing that we have in our arsenal, the biggest mechanism that is present for hypertrophy to happen, for bodybuilding to be successful, is increasing mechanical tension. That's it. And then all of the other pathways are just subsets of mechanical tension on an increase with maybe a different metabolic environment being present at the time. That's really the major difference that is present there. And so if that's the case, then we have that to scale to start with. And then every single decision that we make is going to be around the fact that we have a certain amount of total output, is what I would consider it, that we have the ability to generate within a session, within a week, within a month, within a block, within a year. If we have a limited amount that we have to work with in any one period of time, then we can't have everything prioritized all at once. Everything needs to have an adequate amount of that stimulus of mechanical tension within each of the environments that we know are going to be helpful in their own slightly different ways towards the same goal. They need to be balanced off against each other so that you have the capacity to continue to progress on each one of them over that period of time you're looking at. And so making easy examples, like you said, with the deficit deadlift, for hypertrophy, we already want to prioritize movements that are going to be the best for getting tissue to be laid down, which is going to be in mechanically difficult positions that you're going to be throttled on the amount of actual load that you can use at any one period of time using a large breadth of muscle tissue all at once. Having it more specific to a certain handful of muscles in mechanically difficult positions will take away your overall ability to move the load, but it's not going to take away anything from the actual goal that you're working towards. And so to fit that criteria, something like a stiff leg deadlift works very well for the hinge pattern for all of the tissues that are involved with the hinge, without having too much knee involvement. That's going to allow you to get into the conventional stance more so, leverage everything that you have to give, and then be able to move more load with an easier mechanical position that isn't necessarily going to take each one of those specific muscle groups through their longest transition of length. Every single piece of the length of a tissue under load, you get more of it, you get more hypertrophy by theory. And so having that already starting in place, that's only one piece of one day, one session of 1 week. If we already know that one of those is in place and that is a regressed pattern, we have the ability to put in something that is a progressed pattern, 1 more, 2 more, 3 more, depending on what you actually have the ability to do as you and the individual and you and the environment that you've created for yourself. You have the ability to either decide that you want more of those patterns or less of them with more specificity to the goal that you're going for. That specificity is going to be higher in output, which I determined to be a combination of 4 things: volume, load, general movement competency demand, and time. Those are the major things that set your stimulus to fatigue ratios, which is what is generally going to be the bedrock of what you decide to do with all of your patterns. Starting with the base patterns, moving into secondary patterns, into accessory patterns. You're taking each one of the categories and trying to stack them into one another so you allow yourself to get as close as you can, where all 4 of those things are pedals, like accelerator pedals in a car. If you have all 4 present and you have 1 RPM meter that has its red line, you can decide to put one of them all the way to the floor and you already passed your red line. That's how much ability you have within the session, within the day to give. Put that to the floor, you have nowhere else to go. Any other of the 3, you do the same thing, you have nowhere to go. So your best way to challenge yourself continually over time is to have undulating pressures along all 4 of the pedals. All of those specific demands that set you up for what in that session is that you can actually do, you can continue forward and continue to utilize over broad time that will bring you the progress you're looking to do. Primary patterns for output, generally high skill, squats, deadlift patterns, single leg patterns like lunges, big compound rows, presses in a horizontal or vertical plane, pulls or pushes in either one of them and all the angles between. The less it's stabilized, the more skill it takes. That I would consider being a primary output pattern. A secondary output pattern would be something that's more externally stabilized. That is going to be still somewhat generalized across muscle groups that can contribute, but isolated enough that it doesn't have the same axial loading total contribution as the primary movements. Then accessories would be specific to single muscle groups with implements that'll take the most systemic toll away and have the specific target to either, 1, just add an overall output or volume load to a specific tissue, or use for a secondary purpose for contributing to your overall general movement competency in the primary movements. Building out a week is the way I typically would look to start with, building out programming, and then moving from that point forward. Starting with what is the general goal that we want for the time. The general goal that we want for the moment is based off of what that person needs.
Right.
Do you need more of what tissue? We'll start for bodybuilding purposes. Powerlifting, it works the same.
Mm-hmm.
What pattern do you need more of, or what tissue do you need more of? What is the most demanding? What can you balance off between what else you need to grow in either your number totals or in tissue accrued? Then you balance off the primary patterns off of a week of what you can actually tolerate, with your primary need being number 1. The most volume, the most load, the most specific movement competency placed on that one. And then from there, all of the other patterns of the primary movements will be regressed to a point that you can balance off your overall output for the week that allows you to continue progressing. All the accessory movements are in place to allow your general ability to do those primary patterns to stay intact. Example would be if you have a lot of compound pressing, a lot of benching is going on. You're in internally rotated flex shoulder position. You're going into a plane, into a position that is going to cause eventually, without a balance in the opposite direction, probably some issues with compression of subacromial space and median nerve blocks and all the rest. General issue, a good way to get a handle on that is to get more access into an overhead flexion position within an eccentric control, isometric through all the things that control the shoulder, and eccentric control of the things that actually act at the shoulder while you're moving in that direction. Overhead tricep extension with a cable or a dumbbell. In the opposite, an incline cable curl, which both of those movements would be considered to be just isolation movements for any general bodybuilder. They don't really get a lot of consideration as like, this is something that we want as like a functional movement or a preparatory movement or a rehab movement, because you're doing tricep extensions and bicep curls.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that me and Paul have talked about extensively on here, is the idea that, and I'd like to get your idea on, is the idea that accessories aren't so much used to drive a stimulus, more so than they're used to prep you and create more of a rehab and prehab type of facilitation, right? Like I found that with powerlifters, if we're focusing a lot on accessories to drive tissue, they get beat up a lot, they get banged up a lot. But if we focus on accessories to prep them for their main movements and to allow them to get into those places that they haven't gone into, like you said, with the overhead cable extension, they're a lot healthier and they're less fatigued when it comes to those main movements. Now for powerlifting, that makes a ton of sense, right? Because you want to be as fresh as you can for those three movements that require higher skill acquisition. But in bodybuilding, you're always trying to chase after, right, mechanical tension, one, and then metabolite buildup or cell swelling or muscle damage, right? It all kind of goes into that other bubble of what else drives hypertrophy. Do you find with your accessories, are those things that you're trying to push a stimulus for muscle growth and training closer to failure, or are you using those to allow them to stay injury-free and healthy and able to push the main movers, or a little bit of both? Like, how are you facilitating that within your program?
It would be both, because, and it's easy to balance that way for bodybuilding, because powerlifting, you're pretty much shut into the box of having to have the big patterns in some close iteration to the final product that you're doing.
Of course.
You always have to have something that resembles very closely your competition squat, something that somewhat closely resembles your bench, something that closely resembles your deadlift. Even if you're taking a little bit of time to specifically de-emphasize those things, you're still having another pattern that is going to be generally high output and high skill that is going to take up the place of that so that you can continue to get the adaptation for that specific task when you need it. For bodybuilding, our task is building tissue, but our task is facilitated by having general movement skill that we can apply into a lot of different areas so we can continue to get amassed more and more and more mechanical tension within those patterns. And so we don't have to be tied to any of those specific final end product movements.
Right.
We have our breadth of progressions and regressions brought back a little bit in scope, and it's not quite as wide as what it might be for you guys. And so it doesn't extend quite as far into the skill specific realm where you can just go to the very ends of the limitations that you need to get to for you to retain the capacity to use that output in all of the regress patterns that you would use as secondary movements. And with that being the case, accessory movements, we can have a little bit more working volume in than you guys do, because of the fact that we don't have to go quite as far with the overall generalized stimulus from the biggest patterns that we do. We can scale them a little bit more and spend more time within secondary and accessory movement realms, rather than the primary amount of time spent on the primary output movement realm, which is where you guys have to live.
Right.
And so you guys are limited specifically just by the fact that you have to spend so much time there, where we don't have to. We can make the concessions where we need to, and we're not going to be directly having an issue because of that, The only issue that ends up happening is the same thing that would happen for you guys, is if you guys in powerlifting don't touch the actual base pattern or another pattern that is very similar to it that touches the same prerequisites, forces you to own those ranges and do it well, have all of the movement competency for you to be able to do it. You're not doing it on a generally frequent basis. Those things start to slip away from you.
Yeah.
Then you have to take the time to rebuild that skill to get back in it. Now, we have the same thing happen in bodybuilding, which is honestly like, it's the hill that I'm going to die on in bodybuilding is that because we fall so far into sport specificity, even though they don't really call it that in bodybuilding, for powerlifting, your sport specificity is doing the squat, bench, dead.
That's it.
That's it.
Easy work.
For bodybuilding, our sport specificity is, okay, how little can I make my entire body do something so I can isolate a tissue? That's where it goes. So it ends up becoming like, how can I piece apart every single tiny portion of this body and then address them one by one so that I could do it all and hodgepodge this perfect amalgamation of body parts.
Right.
Where that's not how the human body works. And it's taken this long for anyone to realize that in the bodybuilding room. And that's where we have like long time, generations of bodybuilders that end up relegating themselves to like only machine work, that end up having like catastrophic injuries out of nowhere, like bicep tear, pec tear, lat tear, quad tear. It's like, oh, well, how did that happen? It's the safest movement category that there is. How'd that happen? You conformed yourself into the demands of the machine. You conformed yourself to utilizing only what the machine gives you and not taking responsibility on yourself to have the skill outside of what is demanded of you purely by the machine itself for you to do it. And then if I were to use it as a visual, if the machine is this bubble of how much skill you need, if you sit there forever, you're going to start to conform to it and sit yourself within it. And you're going to lose little bits of it as long as you can become more efficient in the singular path and singular demand that it is to move that implement through space.
Right.
Where you should be, and what keeps you from having a problem, is having yourself able to sit just outside of that realm, so you have complete ownership of everything that happens within it. Just like you guys, like to make that operational, Paul, actually, your squat at the meet, what may have been the case is you sat into the squat, maybe it was lower than you were used to. You didn't have the awareness of exactly where you were supposed to be. It shifted a little bit, and that being a little bit out of that pattern that you had perfect recognition and perfect control over, that may have been with all the other contributing factors that came into play, pulled the ham. Very likely just the fact that you were out of that comfortable range of what you had perfect control over, with all other variables being the same. That's what brought you out of the realm of control, and that's what caused the injury. The same thing happens in the bodybuilding world, but it happens in much less heroic ways. It's
right. That's Tony, I'm a hero.
Huh?
Yeah, that's Tony, I'm a hero.
Very heroic. They're gonna name a CrossFit WOD after you pretty soon.
There you go. But the bodybuilders will tear a bicep on a seated preacher curl machine.
Right.
Like,
so
how do you do that?
Right. So then that would come to the idea of like programming for muscle function versus programming for muscle action, and being able to allow both of those to play an integral role within a bodybuilding program, right? Because so often bodybuilders are like, I just want to have the most output possible. What's going to give me the best and most output? And that's like, can we stabilize this as much as we can? Can we really isolate the muscle? But sometimes you don't necessarily want that within your accessories. Sometimes you want to challenge and create better stability and better patterns, so that when you do go to those, you can forcefully put that output there because you've done all the other prerequisite things to challenge those other stability factors that you're usually not doing if you are focusing just on machines. So do you often find yourself thinking about that in terms of programming? Like, okay, for every muscle action, I'm going to put some muscle function in there so you don't get broken down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually that's a specific delineation that needs to be made and said, is that like the idea of specifically like sitting into a machine or something with a more defined path is going to be by itself creating more output. Is like that's an idea that I'm going to die on the hill for that one, is that is just a platitude that's been said across like everyone within like the bodybuilding world specifically.
Mm-hmm.
It's understood that you sit on a machine and it's externally stabilized, and just by the fact that external stabilization is there, you can have more output. But that doesn't get qualified any further by, okay, well, how stable are you and how much more output are you creating on a bent over dumbbell row, dual arm? If you can move 150 pounds per hand on that and generally not move very much, and you're getting all the tissues to go through their longest transition of length under that load, and you're in a good mechanical position that you're not going to just fall over as it's moving in space, are you more stable there and creating more output there? Or are you more stable in creating more output, laying yourself flat on a bench and draping your hands over and rolling your shoulders forward and just trying to pull the dumbbells through space? You're not nearly as stable. It's just not the case. And it would be the same thing with a T-bar row or a seated row of any kind. Like, you just drape yourself into the machine. And that's exactly what I was saying with the bubble analogy, the poorly made image of the analogy that I was trying to say. It's completely conforming yourself into only the demands that the machine itself covers for you.
Right.
And then you're not taking any responsibility for what it is that you need to produce for you to be stable, because stability isn't an external phenomenon. You can gain internal stability by leveraging external environments, but you do not actually have external stability within itself. It is living within the internal stabilization that you have in your own body that you can generate to a better degree with more contact points with the environment that's unmoving and generally in positions relative to you that allows you to oppose the direction that a force is trying to pull you in. So that would be specifically something that I need to say outright. But then for your programming question, when I am thinking about programming for anyone, especially within like the further that you get along within bodybuilding itself, the more training years you have, focusing a little bit more within, and this is a little bit of a contrarian type of idea, sitting more of the accessory work within the realm of function rather than action, and trying to leverage the function as something that you can build the volume on in general, is going to be better for the overall outcomes than just trying to sit within action alone. And having to balance them off, I mean, to a degree, you will have to. But as far as the actual variables that we have at play for us to build tissue in bodybuilding, or just as human beings, it's increases of mechanical tension over broad time and all of the other subsets and all the other results that happen to that in general environments. If that is just sitting off of a baseline, and how you get hypertrophy to happen is you just raise that baseline over time, then if you start with something that is a function heavy movement as an accessory, but it is taking you through a large breadth of a muscle length, and you have the capacity to be able to progress on it with the load and the volume and time, and the general movement competency demand is already there because it is already itself that exercise that has specific demands within itself, then you can still progress on that and you can still build tissue with it. It's not something that is like you decide on action or you decide on function as the primary reason that it's in a program, and then decide that like because it's for function, it's not going to be effective in bringing on tissue. It may be equally as effective, because the movements that you're going to choose, especially within the bodybuilding realm, you kind of have to steal a shallowism, a Jordan shallowism. You want to be able to grind up the vegetables into the spaghetti sauce with bodybuilders.
Right.
9 times out of 10, and the same thing with powerlifters, I know it.
Yeah, for sure.
You tell them, okay, I want you to do a dowel rod pale rail in external rotation, and I want you to do 2 sets of 10 with that, and I want you to do that like 3/4 of the way through your session, and that's your functional work. Or I want you to take a lacrosse ball and toss it at a wall and catch it and bring yourself functionally back here without your rib cage following with it. That would be something that would help you with this general range of motion that we all suck at.
Yeah.
Which would be an effective way of gaining it. That'd be a functional movement to have in there to gain that capacity. There is 0% chance that a bodybuilder or a powerlifter is going to do that.
For sure.
And so you just get them into a position with a movement that they feel that they're doing something with for their actual goal, and they are actually getting to their goal by using it. You place them into that same position and have them load it. So it would just be overhead cable curl. Holy cow. And then you just get here, and then you can cross that with like a cable Y raise, which is going to be a side delt and bicep move.
Right. Yeah. I guess when you're thinking about external load and you're thinking about functional movements, that's all well and good to put tissue on, as long as you're progressing, you're able to standardize that movement. And I think that's what gets lost with a lot of people when it does come to those internally stabilized patterns, is they're chasing that progressive overload. And then week to week, rep to rep, there's no standardization within that exercise. So is that the first thing you think of when it comes to that type of programming, like stiff leg deadlifts, squats, barbell rows, things like that require the person to have that internal stability that maybe won't necessarily isolate the muscle if they're not able to systematically like bring out the same exact movement pattern every single time? And how do you go about fixing that for that person if that is the case?
I do generally like to start with the base patterns,
Mm-hmm.
but if I already have a good sense of what this person's general ability is, I'm going to place them already onto a regress pattern for most of the things that I have them do to hit the general landmarks, for them to hit the vertical and horizontal pulls and everything in between, the lunge, squat, hinge, all of the basics that need to get touched upon. I'm generally going to start everyone with mostly regress by a couple of steps in the pattern to do the general movement, and then have one of them or two of them that are going to be a little bit more of a generalized primary pattern that will bring out a lot more need for skilled learning.
Yeah.
They only have so much capacity to be able to do that in any period of time. Having them do something really complex that just isn't going to hit well for them is going to make them discouraged with the training as well. It's not helpful anyway.
Right.
So being able to put somebody on a machine for a general pattern and then give them somewhat of generalized cueing rather than getting super specific with a muscular target helps to be able to get them to figure out, okay, well, if I'm thinking, I'll use a row as an example because it makes it easy. But I want to sit somebody on a row and I want them to learn how to do a bent over row at some point. Then I'll just have them, okay, sit on a row, and I want you, before you do anything, unload it, and then draw your entire shoulder, your arm, everything into the position that you can get the most overall travel. Nothing else is a consideration.
Yeah.
Get the most travel possible, and then you'll figure out, oh, that's how my shoulder works. That's how generally, like the whole path that you start to gain the ability to figure out, okay, well, if I come close to here, I kind of feel it this way. I move it out a couple degrees, I kind of feel it this way. Move it out here, I feel it this way. And I notice that these things move and these things don't. It kind of feels weird when my hand's in close or when it's out here.
Mm-hmm.
The little things that you would have to like sit somebody down and go, okay, I want you to do this movement for exactly this. And they already don't know what they're doing with their body. It's like,
yeah,
cool. I don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
So putting them on something that they're just like, just do it. Do it.
Yeah.
You'll figure it out. And just letting them think through it themselves and gain the experience of doing it first is where most of that programming has to start, with somebody that doesn't really have a good general sense of where they're at, and then placing more specific focus on another movement that will be having a better crossover for everything else.
Yeah.
Starting with like a hinge, because it's so difficult for people to generally learn a hinge well the first time. It's a good place to start with getting them on a regress pattern by having it closer to the final form than the rest of them to start with. It takes so much fine tuning, and they can figure that out if you spend the time with them, and you only have enough time allotted to them. They only have enough focus allotted within them They only have the ability to spend as much of their resources doing that movement as possible. You can't have them do a ton of volume with it. It's just going to be an iterative process from start to finish on everything to that point anyway. You start with something that'll get you a big bang for your buck that will teach you how your body works for the rest of it.
Yeah.
You get a good hinge, you're going to be better at feeling out how you're going to squat later.
Right. Yeah.
Get a good hinge, you have a better idea of how you're going to do any bent over rowing or any sort of bent over position or any rowing of any kind. You have a general idea of how your bracing is going to work on all of your compound patterns.
Yeah. Yeah. I also think too, like programming is also building confidence. And if you're constantly having to regress someone because of your incompetence as a coach of giving them too much too soon, that's going to be very debilitating to that person. Like, oh man, why are we taking steps backwards? You know, as you said, just start there. And that way they're always constantly winning. They're always progressing in some shape or form. Right. And I think that that's so important. A lot of coaches, well, I don't know if I say a lot of coaches, but coaches in general sometimes have a tendency not to think about building up confidence in an athlete within their program. And a lot of them, especially when it comes to like trainers, personal trainers, it's like, how can we burn this person into the ground and make them feel like they just had the best workout of their life without actually having any rhyme or reason to it, you know? And I think that having those regression patterns already there, that way they have 2 or 3 steps to go in the coming year. I think that's extremely important and builds confidence, builds buy-in, and builds trust in the coach. Like, oh, the coach isn't making me look like an idiot. You know, I'm not doing a dowel rod row when I was doing barbell rows for the first block, right? So I think that that's extremely important. What do you got, Paul?
Yeah. Well, I just really liked, you mentioned how you use the constraint of the movement or the exercise selection that you've given that person to teach them a skill. So something like, you know, lately I've had a number of clients unable to hinge into their squat. They always end up going to anterior pelvic tilt. Well, how about I just front load their squat? And then they literally cannot anterior pelvic tilt without dumping the bar. So I've introduced a movement constraint to teach a movement skill, but I'm putting them in a position that has immediate feedback, positive or negative.
Yep.
And I think that's something that gets lost a lot of the time. And I think it's an invaluable skill as an online coach, especially.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time you can't be there in person. You can't be there in person. And it's often difficult to communicate nuanced things like that. Even something as simple as, okay, well, we're going to do a Zercher good morning as opposed to a backloaded good morning. Immediately, you stack pelvis and rib cage. That anterior load prevents anterior pelvic tilt. Boom. Now they can transfer that skill over to that squat pattern. And you know, again, you're not regressing them. They're probably doing something that they've never done before. So they think it's cool. It's kind of badass because they're doing Zerchers, and then they're having fun. Right? They're building confidence and having fun. Not that Zerchers are fun. They're not fun.
Yeah, no.
No, because then you got to get the pad, because you got to put the pad on, and then people are like, "Oh, the guy has a pad, and why is he?" Because I'm not doing Zerchers with a skinny bar. I have small joints. It's gonna mess up my biceps. Gonna leave
You
marks.
do have small joints.
I do. I have a huge head, but small joints. It's weird.
Very dainty.
I've been told that. So you kind of hit on mechanical tension being the driving factor of myofibrillar growth, and that seems to be one of the main mechanisms to have muscle size. What do you think about the idea of like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and focusing on that within a training paradigm? Do you think that that has any merit? I know the study that came out on it with Cody Hahn, you know, they only took the responders and they didn't actually look at the non-responders, but when you add the non-responders and the responders, there seemed to be no difference at all. So what do you think about the idea of like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and growth outside of myofibrillar to elicit like an adaptation in terms of bodybuilding?
I think it's absolutely an important piece. But I'll say this too, to expand on the way that I approach the way that I set out the mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Mechanical tension being the number one, and then everything else, I view it as like a tree beyond that point. If that's the main mechanism, then muscular damage is a result of increased mechanical tension beyond what your actual tolerance is for that tissue within that length. Mm-hmm. Then for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, it's going to be the cell swelling within the area, the metabolic damage that happens as a result of the contractions. And then as a result of those things, or because of that happening, it's the mechanical tension that started that point. It's the concentric contractions and then the trapping of the metabolites within the area that causes further damages to the tissue, right? And so as a result, regardless, it's going to be from the tension that is generated either internally or externally, and they're going to be a result of one another. And so the tension is the number one thing. And from that point, all of the other things are stemmed. And then to think further, mechanical tension is to start. And then all the rest of the mechanisms of growth, being the downstreams, they're just different gradations of what happens at what internal and external environments are being created for them to happen. And so a different environment internally is going to determine whether it's myofibrillar or sarcoplasmic, just by the fact that internal environment being higher presence of those metabolites and the environment that you have constrained to happen with the way that you executed a movement, with how much volume is done within a certain dense period of time. That's what created that response. That's what created the environment itself. It still stems from one place. So that's the way that I view it. And so I don't think that it's invalid in any way.
Yeah.
I think that it's definitely present and it's something that should be present. And it's a good tool to have in place, because if I bring it back to the full pedals again, or accelerator pedals of general output, as I would term it, you have all of them to play with. The sarcoplasmic route of hypertrophy, of creating that environment internally, is just you pressing really hard on the volume and time element.
Yeah.
So the load is drawn back. It's pretty much just sitting completely upright. You haven't touched it really. It's quite low. But if output is what actually brings you to the overall demand that creates the hypertrophy, then you have the ability to press on any of them to any degree that brings you closer to the red line. Being closer to that red line within a degree is what is going to generate the response. And so you've just chosen volume is near to the floor, time is near to the floor. And there you go. You created the response through a different means with less general movement competency demand and less load. And so it ends up within the same paradigm.
Do you try to undulate that within the day of the program or within the week of the program?
It depends on what we're going for with the goal of the body part and
Gotcha.
which body part. And the body part, honestly, for the most part, you don't need to extend too far into the load realm for most smaller body parts that we would use that kind of setup for. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy being something that I would say, especially bodybuilding wise, is more centered around like side delts, rear delts, biceps, triceps.
Makes sense.
Like it's the smaller body parts that don't lend themselves very well to going into the load realm and having good progressive runway for. That we would utilize those other progressive measures to get a little bit more out of them and progress them forward, all towards the same means of hitting close to that red line. But then it's also present as something that you could put in as a way to mediate your output totals for larger body parts as well. So quads, hamstrings, and everything else. You have the ability to put them in, stack them within a session or within a week. And I would prefer to stack them more within a session rather than a week, unless you're to the point that you really need and you can generate so much ridiculous output in total within a body part or one session all at once. And no matter what you do to structure that session, if you're hitting anywhere within a loading realm to get yourself closer to that red line for the stimulus to happen, if no matter what approach you take is going to take a lot out of you systemically, then you may be cornered into the point that you have to really refocus and put a lot more into the bucket of the sarcoplasmic realm into another session entirely, because you just don't have the ability to push that load, the load lever down any further for another day.
Yeah. I think that's something that gets lost within bodybuilding and within the paradigm of like research, where it's like volume is the biggest driver of hypertrophy. But it's like, once you've created the muscle protein synthesis, once you've created that stimulus within that muscle, you don't need to add 3 more sets to it. Like, you got it, you're done. Like, let it recover, let it adapt. Don't continue to add more and more to it. I think that's something that as bodybuilders, especially, it's like more is better. And it's like, maybe you only need one set. Maybe you only need one set of, and maybe if you're having trouble recovering, do a BFR set instead of a regular high metabolic set, right? And
Yep.
and if you look at the literature on higher volume training, right? One, people dread it more. The actual ability to get to failure is less and less the higher the volume is, the higher the rep range is. So they drift further and further away from that failure point because it just sucks. And then also too, right? If you're dreading that session, that perceived effort is going to increase your amount of fatigue that you have going into that session. So it's like you have to pick and choose when you're doing those. If you end every session with a high metabolic demand, especially on like leg and back days and stuff like that, that person's going to need to deload every 2 or 3 weeks because they're just fucking miserable. They don't want to go to the gym anymore, right? You have to give them some fun days, not just days that are going to absolutely kill them too. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot more, is like making sure my athletes leave the gym most of the time, like 80 to 90% of the time, feeling better than when they came into it and happy, right? They're not feeling like, oh, fuck, I just killed myself on legs. I got to pull myself back into the gym in 6 days to do it again. It's like, no, you don't want that every single time. And you don't need that every single time, right? That stimulus doesn't require you to puke every single time. It's not necessary. Right. And if you're having to deload every 3 weeks because the person's miserable because you're doing so much volume, then you're not progressing either. Right. So I think that fine balance of adding that in there, which you touched on perfectly, I think is very important.
Yeah. If I can jump down another rabbit hole that you brought up, another one of the, because I'm going to be like drawn and quartered and I'm going to die on a bunch of hills apparently by the time my career is over.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Well, not too many guys in our sport are climbing hills. We're really fat and out of shape. So you're good on most of them.
We walk really flat.
But the volume being the key driver to growth thing irks me almost more than any other topic.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why, like, I actually in a no switch seminar with John Jewett and Luke, we did one a little while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Just the one that we did last time, I actually brought up.
Yeah, you guys kicked me out of it. I was no longer invited to these things, and it's like, of course I'm not. I'm not a bodybuilder. Of course you guys are going to kick me out. But man, it still hurt.
Well, we can set up one by ourselves, Tony. Maybe you and Paul can do one if you want to. That'd be wonderful.
He's stuck in Canada, man.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's okay. But I actually brought up and I made an entire presentation on generally the idea that I'm talking about here is the output total being the 4 pedals. And with that just being as it would be, I mean, volume itself, the way that we can study it as a variable, I mean, just to put it as simple as possible, like the whole everybody thinking that volume is the key driver to growth sits couched in just one simple fact about what we can do with our research. Is the fact that, okay, well, if the argument is either load or volume, if we're trying to sit every one of the participants within a certain realm close to failure, which we pretty much want to get them to failure so that we can standardize that as a part of the method. If we already have that in place, what is it that we can change on the day or in the week or in the next month that we can just build by top-down demand? Can we bring them from a 8 to 10 rep max that they fail at that load? Can we just automatically say, oh no, we're going to double that load now and you're going to fail at 8 to 10 reps today? Like, no, that's impossible. But what can you do? You can triple their volume on the day and have them do that same set or sit within the same 8 to 10 rep of failure with whatever load it is that has to sit there. And then the load is just changed by what they can tolerate at the moment. The volume can be done regardless. And so it makes it such a ridiculous claim to say that volume is the key driver to growth, because we can just decide arbitrarily, okay, well, you're going to fail at 8 to 10 with that load. We're just going to do that 7 times. Like, okay, are you going to get more stimulus from doing that once or 7 times? Obviously 7 times. You're going to get more to happen doing it 7 times than once, but you can't on the day decide that you're going to double the load and then go, okay, well, that was so much better because they failed anyway with half of it. It's impossible. And so it makes it in itself a constraint that it's an impossibility for that to be tested in the exact same way, one method versus another.
Right.
The only way that we have to look at it is taking it into the 4 pedals, all of the things that create output, what we have as a general ability for all of our bodily systems to contribute into what we do as general movement towards the output total that creates the response. If we look at it as that, as a contribution of load and volume and time in general movement competency for basically for axial loading and how much skill and how much overall tissue needs to be used at one time. If we have all of those in play, that makes it really easy to conceptualize, oh, well, we're just looking at one small portion within these studies of what is it that we can push so that we can see the output total get brought up to a point that creates a response. Yeah. What is it that we have the ability to change on the day? Volume. We don't really have the ability to change load in the same way. We can change time in the same way. We can change movement competency demand in the same way, but that's also going to be limited by the movement skill of the person you have doing the thing and how uniform you can get that movement skill to be across a large swath of people, which is impossible to do with anything that demands any sort of prerequisite of skill.
I've been in enough research places to know that standardization of movement quality is nothing they ever talk about or think about. And you're right when it comes to the volume research, man. It's like it's a subsection of individuals who publish that data and they continue to pat each other on the back, telling each other like, that's exactly what it is. It's like if you're an NFL offense and you know the defense, right? You're always going to win. They know how to set up these studies. They know that volume is the one thing that they can dictate. And of course, it's always going to look favorable. But anecdotally, the guys who are putting on muscle, the guys who are putting on tissue, the guys who are getting stronger, they're not doing more volume. They're probably doing less volume. Right. Mm-hmm. As we get stronger, we don't need to do more. We just need to get very efficient and very strong and do less and recover. Right. But for some reason, these 130-pound hypertrophy experts are telling us what to do with our volume training. It's like, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah.
Paul, you have any last questions?
I do. So, okay. I really love how you kind of use the word output as this umbrella, right? Like the 4 pedals that contribute to output. And I think it's pretty easy after listening to this conversation that you can look at that within an exercise, within an entire session, within an entire week. Now, when you program for your athletes, are you kind of standardizing it across the board and saying, this is our training week, we're going to see how you respond, iterate upon that? Or are you kind of allowing them some wiggle room of auto-regulation based on how they feel on that day?
Both, to a degree.
Okay.
To a degree. So I set out what's going to happen, what I expect in the general layout of everything. And so the way I set up in the way like a training sheet that I would build out for somebody, it would be the exercise, it would be the sets done, it would be the rep range for which set, and then the tempo, and then the rest time and the cueing.
Okay.
Is the way that everything reads out as you go across. Okay. And then intensity techniques is also in there in case that is going to be utilized.
Right.
But with that being generally what it's going to be, that sits pretty tightly within the range of what I want them to have happen. But where the auto regulation comes in is, okay, well, if you're going to be doing 3 sets, but I only have 2 rep targets in play, there's going to be a delineation between where they are sitting. So like a 6 to 8 rep target and like a 15 to 20 for movement. The auto regulation comes in is like, okay, if I have 3 or more sets there, I'm not going to tell you, okay, generally, I want you to do 2 at 6 to 8 and 1 at 15 to 20. So if you feel like you're snappy and you're strong and everything's clicking, do a double top set at 6 to 8. Send it, take it, because it's there. If it's not there, then get yourself far enough away from that demand that you would have to have present for you to generate enough for you to do 2 sets within that load. Move it up, do double at the higher volume, because it won't take nearly as much out of you to go there. So if you're going to be sitting behind, auto-regulate into that. Rest times, I have as a general sit as long as you need to for you to be able to come back.
It's right up my alley. Okay.
Unless you're doing like metabolic work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Then it's tighter, but then
Yeah.
up to that point, it's just what it is. And when I put in an RIR scale, because I do have those in there as well, they're both a dictation of what I want to see. And it's an auto-regulatory measure for them themselves to put in, okay, well, I wasn't quite there. I went to an X is the way I denote it. It's either a number or an X on a big primary movement pattern. Because other than that, if it's a smaller pattern, I'm not really going to give them like, okay, well, bicep curls, you're going to take it to 2 RIR.
Yeah.
Why? It's not why. No.
Why?
Yeah. No, it makes no sense. So no. But if you're going to be doing a hack squat or a safety bar squat or a back squat or front squat, whatever, then I'm going to put in like, what is the RIR that I want you to be at? So generally an RPE matching to the RIR being just the opposite side of 10. And then having an X there as well. X meaning to technique failure or extreme loss of control. That would be there as, okay, well, I probably have another 2 or 3 reps here, but I'm not going to do it. I can't do it. You have the ability to stop exactly when it is that you need to stop. That's there as well. And then obviously RIR within itself is pretty nebulous. So that in itself, when that's imposed, is itself an auto-regulatory measure, even if you don't intend for it to be.
Yeah, Tony and I have had chats about that because like RIR for me when I do hypertrophy work, like I have no fucking idea.
Yeah. That's the biggest issue with it. So what actually, I'll say this too, because I use it as a number because it makes it easier to do just on the side of like programming it top down.
Right.
But when explaining it, I typically like to tell people that like within like 3 reps to failure, at the 3rd, you're going to start to notice yourself, the speed of your concentric is going to drop by like 30%.
Yeah. I'm like, I'll do a set, say like a pendulum squat or something.
Yeah.
And then be like, okay, that set was really hard. And I'm like, I almost missed. And then I'll watch the video. I'm like, fuck.
There is a skill component to training failure for sure.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's one of the other things is that it's if you don't spend time really going there, and it's skill specific to the movements themselves. Because even those, and you guys are really good at finding all of my hills. But here's another one is again in the same vein of machines being like the easiest thing for anyone to be doing, and they don't have their own specific skill related demands to them, is complete and utter horseshit. Anyone that moves any sort of appreciable load on a hack or a pendulum or literally like any machine movement that you can put a significant amount of load on, you get past a certain threshold of load, you are going to be stopped in your progression by your ability to have the skill to do it. It is a skill component by that point. On a hack squat, you can only take it so far as you have the ability to keep composure in your breathing, in your bracing, your timing, the initiation of the concentric out of the bottom, your ability to decelerate yourself before you get to the bottom, your control over your ankles as you get into the bottom, because collapse is going to completely cause an issue. Like you don't have the ability to control, you're going to lose it.
So we just add more reverse bands.
Exactly.
Oh my God. I saw a kid.
Bands, wrap your knees.
I saw a kid at the gym today had 4 plates on each side of the Arsenal hack and a big green band, like one of the like 2-inch wide bands.
Oh,
It's like, come on, man.
that's like half of the load.
I was gonna say that's an empty carriage, pretty much.
Yeah, empty. Like,
Oh man. Oh, great point though. I definitely agree with that. Skill acquisition is important on barbell movements and machines all in of themselves. So great point. Paul, you have anything else that you want to end on?
No, man. I really enjoyed that. I'm gonna be in Florida in January, so hit you up.
All right, man. Sweet.
We'll do some,
He's
some
in
bodybuilder
Stuart, so
stuff.
he's not that far away. He's gonna be in Miami. He has a meet in Miami, so we can all meet up maybe in Stuart and check out your gym. Possibly
I'll be
in Miami.
at a meeting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'll be competing. I'm a bodybuilder as of today. I did a back and biceps day today.
You've officially crossed over.
Oh, and I
Good
also
for you.
used prime handles.
Oh,
Look at that.
It's over,
You're there.
man.
Yeah.
Powerlifting's done.
once you add the neon greens, you're like no longer a power lifter.
They are so lovely.
They're great. Yeah, great piece
They're
of
nice,
equipment.
huh?
For sure.
And then my buddy had the fat handles that have like a slight camber on the outside.
Calves.
Oh, so nice.
Yeah.
It's almost like I don't have biceps tendonitis.
Hey, look at that. A little confident. All right, Nick, man, we won't keep you any longer. Really appreciate your time, buddy. Thanks so much
Yeah,
for
thank
coming
you.
on and chatting with us.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, guys. It's fun.
If anybody wants to get a hold of you for coaching or anything like that, please do your Instagram where he puts out some amazing content and any of your services.
Yep. Just everything that you need to know about me, anything you need to find is linked to my Instagram. So it's just Nick Gloff. Pretty easy. It's just my name. So you just go there, give a follow if you like to read entire walls of texts every single day.
It is a bit wordy.
It's verbose.
So if that's your thing, I'm your guy. Hit up the page, and then in my bio, I have all of the things that I'm affiliated with. All of like upcoming seminars, upcoming anything else. My coaching links are all in there. All of the affiliation links for everybody that I'm associated with. Everything is all right there. So go ahead and check that out if you want to see what I have going on. But that's it.
Perfect, man. Awesome.
Sweet.
Definitely give him a follow, guys. It's amazing content that he puts out for free. So definitely worth checking out. Appreciate your time, Nick, and we'll look forward to talk some more, man.